His name was Saul of Tarsus, and his boots struck hard against the dry, dusty road outside Jerusalem. It was the year 35 AD. The sun was unforgiving, but Saul didn't flinch. His long robe flapped in the wind as he marched with letters in his hands, papers soaked in power and hatred. His mind raced faster than his steps. He had permission to arrest Christians. To him, they were poison. Noise trailed him, men whispering, animals grunting, metal jingling. Saul didn't smile. His eyebrows curved like blades. In his heart, something trembled, but he told himself it was only dust. He had been proud of his education. Raised under Jewish law, Saul memorized scripture like children memorize lullabies. But this was no lullaby. He knew how to debate, how to accuse, how to destroy heresy. Saul believed Christians were liars. Dangerous. Enemies of the law. And worse, they called Jesus God. That alone made Saul's blood boil. His heart beat with hunger for control. His brain, sharpened like a sword, planned every move. He had no doubt he was right. But in the corner of his mind, a strange fear crouched like a thief. He didn't know it had already entered the room. The road to Damascus was long and dry. Stones cracked under his sandals. The heat made the air waver like smoke. Saul's companions rode beside him, talking in hushed tones. No one wanted to distract him. He looked ahead, eyes like fire, gripping the reins of his horse as if he held the world's justice in his palm. Suddenly, without warning, light exploded from the sky. Not warm light. Not gentle light. But a blast, a violent, blinding white wall that swallowed everything. Saul screamed and fell to the ground. His voice broke the silence. And then, everything went black. His arms trembled. He reached out, but his hands felt only dust and stone. His eyes were open, but all he saw was nothing. Darkness. Thick and endless. The men with him panicked, shouting words he couldn't process. His ears rang like 1,000 bells. Saul tried to stand but collapsed again. His knees scraped the earth. He could feel shame crawling up his skin like ants. Something had spoken. A voice like thunder wrapped in sorrow. It had asked why Saul was persecuting it. Not them, but it. As if the voice and the Christians were the same. 3 days passed. 3 long days in darkness. Saul was led by the hand like a child. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. The man who had once stood like a lion now sat like a lamb, blind, silent, shaking. His thoughts were not clear. Questions raced in his chest like caged birds. Who was the voice? Why had it come with such force? Why now? He had seen people die for Jesus. Stephen, the Christian boy he helped stone, haunted his mind now. Saul remembered his face. Not angry. Not scared. But peaceful. Too peaceful. And that frightened him more than death. The house was small and dim. Saul lay on a mat, his body hollow. He felt weak, but it wasn't from hunger. Something had broken inside him, like a wall that had protected his pride. Outside, camels groaned and merchants shouted. The world continued, but for Saul, time had stopped. Inside, he thought about all the people he had hurt. The families he had split. The fear he had caused. He once believed he was doing God's work. Now, he wasn't sure if he even knew who God was. He felt like a murderer. And in some ways, he was. Then came Ananias. A Christian. A man who had every reason to hate Saul. But he entered the house calmly, like he had rehearsed peace. He placed his hands on Saul's head, and something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. Light entered again. Not just in vision, but in spirit. Saul gasped. The room turned bright. His chest filled with warmth. His heart, once filled with hate, now pulsed with something unfamiliar. Mercy. Saul began to weep. Not because he could see, but because he now realized how blind he had always been. He had seen with eyes, but not with truth. He was baptized the same day. The water washed his body, but something deeper washed his soul. Saul was no longer Saul. He became Paul, the servant of Jesus. The name change wasn't magic. It was death and rebirth. The old Saul, the destroyer, was gone. Paul now lived, and he would carry the wounds of his past like a broken sword turned into a cross. But not everyone trusted him. Some Christians ran when they saw him. Some called him a spy. But Paul didn't blame them. If he were in their shoes, he'd run from himself too. Paul began preaching. Not softly. Not carefully. But boldly, like a man who had risen from fire. He spoke of Jesus not as a myth, but as someone he met. Someone who blinded him to open his soul. Crowds listened with mixed faces, some angry, some stunned. Some threw stones. Some threw questions. Paul accepted them all. He told stories of light, of forgiveness, of the moment when hate melted in the arms of love. He no longer sought revenge. He only sought truth. But the ones who once gave him letters to kill Christians? They now wanted to kill him. Paul escaped Damascus in a basket. At night. Lowered through a window. Like a criminal. Like a secret. He was hunted by the very men who once celebrated him. Now, he was a traitor. A ghost. A target. Paul hid in shadows, but not in silence. He wrote letters. He studied. He listened. He cried. The fire in his chest didn't burn with rage anymore, it burned with purpose. He realized Christianity wasn't just about worship. It was about dying to self, rising again, and walking a road few dared to walk. A road of pain, but also of peace. For years, Paul disappeared. Into deserts. Into towns. Into long nights of prayer. But God was not silent. Paul received visions, whispers and dreams, and courage stitched into his bones. When he reappeared, people were shocked. He hadn't quit. He hadn't vanished in shame. He had only gone deeper into truth. Paul began visiting cities, Antioch, Lystra, Derbe. He walked miles through sandstorms, climbed hills with bleeding feet, faced mobs with wild eyes. He was beaten with rods, whipped like a criminal, left for dead. But each scar made him stronger. Not in body, but in belief. In Lystra they stoned him. His head bled. His arms dangled like ropes. His breath came in ragged gasps. People thought he was dead. They dragged him out of the city like trash. But Paul stirred. His fingers moved. His chest rose. He stood. And instead of running away, he walked back into the same city that tried to kill him. His friends begged him to stop. But Paul wasn't afraid of death anymore. He had already met the one who conquered it. And in his soul, he knew something many feared to believe: suffering could be holy. Paul wasn't perfect. He got tired. He got lonely. He made mistakes. But he never gave up. He traveled across seas in wooden ships, through storms that snapped masts and flooded decks. He wrote letters by candlelight, his hands shaking, his eyes sore. Letters to churches that argued, disobeyed, and sometimes forgot love. But Paul never forgot. He reminded them who Jesus was, who they were meant to be. He taught them about grace. Not cheap grace, but grace that came with blood and tears. And everywhere he went, he carried the same message: Christ crucified. Christ risen. Christ alive. Once Paul was shipwrecked. The waves pounded like war drums. The wind howled like a wild beast. The boat cracked open. Men screamed. Paul didn't. He prayed. When they washed up on Malta, cold and bruised, the islanders thought they were cursed. A snake bit Paul. He shook it off like dust. They waited for him to die. But he didn't. He kept living. Kept serving. Kept teaching. Paul's life became one long miracle. Not of comfort, but of resilience. Not of riches, but of faith. Every trial deepened his trust. Every storm pointed back to the cross. By now, Paul's name was spreading like fire. Some called him a saint. Some called him a lunatic. He didn't care. His mission wasn't to be liked, it was to finish the race. He spoke before kings and beggars. He debated with philosophers and children. His eyes had seen too much to turn back now. But deep in his heart, he knew his journey would end in chains. Still, he moved forward. Toward Jerusalem. Toward Rome. Toward the unknown. He once dragged Christians out of their homes. Now, he entered homes to comfort them. That's what grace looks like. The road to Jerusalem wasn't paved with gold. It was rough and sharp, filled with whispers of betrayal. Paul felt it in his bones. The tension. The warning. Even his friends begged him not to go. But Paul moved like a man walking into a storm on purpose. He had written letters to the churches, telling them to love one another, to stay awake in faith, to never forget the blood that bought them. Yet as he walked toward the holy city, Paul wasn't just thinking about others. He was preparing to die. And he was strangely calm. Jerusalem was not quiet. The streets hummed with tension. Rumors flew like flies over a battlefield. Paul's presence cracked the air. He had once entered that city with power to arrest. Now he entered it with a soul to surrender. Some welcomed him. Some cursed him. Some watched from behind corners, gripping stones in their fists. Paul climbed the temple steps with heavy feet. Not from fear, but from the weight of memory. This was the city where Stephen had been killed. Where Paul had smiled during murder. Now it was his turn to kneel, not to accuse, but to serve. It didn't take long. A riot broke out. People screamed his name with hatred. Hands grabbed him. Fists landed. Sand rose. Robes tore. The mob tried to kill him right there in the temple courts. Soldiers rushed in, Roman guards, breaking through the crowd with weapons raised. They found Paul half-beaten, eyes swollen, body crumpled like a thrown coat. They didn't understand what crime he had committed. But they saw rage in the people's eyes, and they knew this man was dangerous. Paul wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was only thinking of one thing. This is how Jesus was treated too. They chained him. The metal felt cold on his wrists, but familiar. Paul had written about spiritual chains. Now he felt physical ones. The guards dragged him through the streets, past merchants and children. Dust filled his nose. Blood crusted his lips. Still, he looked up at the sky. Not for help, but for clarity. He knew he would never walk these streets as a free man again. His mission had changed shape. He was no longer the traveler, the church planter, the tent maker. He had become something else. A prisoner of Christ. And he was ready. The trials began. First in Jerusalem. Then in Caesarea. Then again before governors and kings. Paul stood in courtrooms where marble floors gleamed and eyes of power watched like hawks. He didn't flinch. He spoke of his past. Of his change. Of the light that shattered his blindness. The governors were puzzled. The priests were furious. The crowds were restless. But Paul's voice did not shake. He told them he was not ashamed. Not afraid. He said the truth was worth dying for. And the truth was a person. A man nailed to wood who had risen from death. One of the rulers, a king dressed in robes stitched with gold, said Paul's words almost made him believe. Almost. But not quite. Paul was not looking for applause. He wasn't trying to win a case. He was trying to light a fire. A fire of faith in rooms filled with cold law. But in every city, the same shadow followed him, death. And yet Paul didn't run from it. He had once chased Christians like prey. Now he walked like one of them. Hunted. Hated. Holy. Rome waited for him. So Paul, in chains, appealed to Caesar. He was loaded onto a Roman ship with other prisoners. The ocean stretched wide and blue. The sun hung like a burning eye. Paul stood on the deck, staring at the sea. He felt small. Yet rooted. A storm was coming. He felt that too. Not in the air, but in his soul. The ship rocked. Days turned gray. Then black. Winds howled like wolves. Waves climbed like giants. The ship snapped. Screams filled the night. Men prayed. Others cursed. Paul held to the mast and whispered not for rescue, but for courage. He knew the storm couldn't kill him until his mission ended. The ship shattered. Wood cracked like bones. Paul plunged into the water. Cold. Deep. Endless. He swam toward the faint line of shore, his chains clinking beneath the waves. Others followed. Some drowned. Paul reached Malta, gasping. He lay on the wet sand, half dead. But not broken. Fires were lit. Clothes dried. Paul gathered wood for warmth. A viper leapt from the firewood and bit his hand. Onlookers gasped. They waited for him to swell and die. He didn't. He shook off the snake. Like shaking off fear. Like shaking off Saul. Paul healed the sick on that island. Even in chains, he freed others. When spring came, they sailed again. This time, toward destiny. Toward Rome. The city of iron and empire. Paul had never seen such power in stone and pride. Soldiers marched like machines. Statues of gods stood tall and cold. Paul, in his rags and shackles, was just another criminal to them. But to God, he was a torch. A witness. A man with letters and fire in his bones. He was placed under house arrest. Not in a dungeon, but not free. Chains still clung to his wrists. But his pen was free. And Paul began to write again. From his little room, Paul wrote letters that would travel farther than any ship. He wrote to Timothy, his spiritual son. To the Ephesians. To the Philippians. To the churches that struggled, that fought, that doubted. His words were soaked in truth and tears. He spoke of pressing on, of finishing the race, of joy and suffering. His words bled with wisdom. He had nothing left to lose. That made him dangerous. That made him honest. His letters weren't just sermons. They were final gifts. The last breath of a man who had poured everything out for a cross he once hated. The guards assigned to Paul changed shifts, but all heard the same message. Jesus. Grace. Hope. The empire thought Paul was locked away. But his words were slipping through walls like wind. Roman guards were whispering faith in secret. Slaves were humming songs of Christ. The emperor's court felt tremors they couldn't explain. Paul's chains rang louder than trumpets. His jail became a church in disguise. Sometimes, late at night, he would close his eyes and remember the road to Damascus. The light. The blindness. The voice. And he would whisper thanks, not for comfort, but for mercy that found him in darkness. He grew older. His steps slower. His beard gray. His hands stiffer. But his eyes, those deep, fire-filled eyes, never lost light. He heard rumors. That Nero was turning cruel. That Christians were being burned, tortured, thrown to lions. Paul didn't tremble. He only prayed. For courage. For the church. For the world. He knew the time had come. He wasn't afraid to die. What terrified him was leaving anything unsaid. So he wrote one more letter. One final echo. He told Timothy to be strong. To keep preaching. To endure suffering. To fight the good fight. Paul was saying goodbye. His final days were quiet. No parades. No visitors in fancy robes. Just silence. And writing. Paul thought of Peter. Of James. Of the young churches growing like wildflowers between stones. He thought of Stephen's face. And of the smile on Jesus' face when he first opened his eyes again. Paul's body was tired. But his spirit felt like sunrise. He had been many things in life: hunter, preacher, prisoner. But now he was ready to be a martyr. A seed in the ground. Buried, yes. But so others could rise. One morning, the guards came for him. No words. Just nods. Paul rose. His ankles were bruised from chains. His back bent from lashes. But he walked straight. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He walked like a soldier going home. Past statues. Past torches. Past fear. His execution wasn't public. Not like others. They said he was a Roman citizen. So they chose the sword. It was quick. Clean. Cold. Paul knelt. The blade rose. And in one moment, his earthly race ended. His breath stopped. But his words never did. They still run. They still burn. They still save. He died outside the city. Not in a temple. Not in a throne room. But on earth stained with blood and dust. Paul's body fell, but his spirit rose. He had once held scrolls of death. Now, his letters became scriptures of life. Churches whispered his name. Enemies cursed it. But heaven welcomed him. Not as Saul the destroyer. Not even as Paul the preacher. But as a son finally home. And the world would never be the same. Paul was gone. But his presence didn't fade like smoke. It lingered. It spread. His words, written in dim corners of stone rooms, began to travel faster than ships. His name passed through mouths like a flame from torch to torch. To some, he was a traitor who turned against his own law. To others, he was the greatest teacher since Jesus. But to heaven, Paul was a story of transformation, a man who had once dragged Christians to death but died as one of them, arms stretched wide in surrender, his heart soaked in mercy. Across the empire, his letters were read aloud. In secret rooms. In candlelit gatherings. By trembling hands. His words told of grace, not just kindness, but power to forgive what seemed unforgivable. Paul had lived it. He had once been the storm. Now, his writings were shelter. His letters were maps for broken people, pointing not to religion, but to resurrection. He taught that no past was too ugly for God. No soul too ruined. His voice lived on in every letter. Be strong. Endure. Run your race. Even as he lay in the dust, Paul's fire refused to die. Some of his letters became scripture. Others got passed between churches like treasure. They were copied by hand, folded into satchels, hidden under cloaks. Paul never built a house. Never raised an army. Yet the world he touched began to change. People who had once bowed to Caesar began bowing to Christ. Families who lived in fear now found freedom in faith. Women, slaves, children, once forgotten, were now seen, heard, cherished. Paul had planted seeds, and now they bloomed in places he had never seen. Not because he was perfect, but because he was surrendered. His teachings weren't soft. They burned. He spoke of dying to self. Of taking up your cross. Of counting everything as loss for the sake of knowing Jesus. He didn't promise riches. He didn't promise comfort. He promised truth. And truth, he said, was a person. One who had bled. One who had risen. One who had met him on a road and changed the shape of his entire life. Paul didn't want people to follow him. He wanted them to follow the light. The same light that had blinded him into seeing. His life raised a brutal, beautiful question: can a murderer become a saint? Paul's story answered, yes. But only through surrender. Only through grace. His hands once held the ropes that killed Stephen. Later, those same hands built tents, served the poor, and lifted others from despair. Paul became living proof that God didn't use the perfect. He used the willing, the repentant, the broken. That's why his story still shakes hearts. Because it tells us we're not stuck in who we were. We can rise. We can be made new. Even the worst of us can be redeemed. His sufferings were not wasted. The beatings, the stonings, the hunger, the snakebite, the loneliness, the chains. Each one pressed Paul deeper into the mystery of Christ. He wrote that suffering produced endurance. And endurance, character. And character, hope. And hope, he said, never disappoints. Because it was rooted not in this world, but in the world to come. Paul didn't just preach heaven. He ached for it. Not because life was hard, but because he had glimpsed something greater. Something that made every lash, every scar, every tear, worth it.